So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Brookings Institution for the launch of the OECD Economic Survey of the United States. Today's event marks an important milestone whereby the OECD takes stock of the economic and policy outlook for the U.S. and presents potential options to improve the United States economy. It is an important process that allows member countries and the OECD staff to share their experience and insight into how to promote healthy, sustainable growth. I very much look forward to the details of the release, which I understand is public as of the start of this event. So these surveys are conducted every 2 years. In 2022, the OECD focused on policies to strengthen the American middle class. Recommendations included a substantial boost in funding for public child care, a better focus on job retraining, and expanding the scope of pharmaceutical drugs subject to negotiation under Medicare. These are not only sound proposals, but also issues that we have studied in depth here at the Brookings Institution. This year's survey will focus on the long-run fiscal imbalance. It is, of course, a noteworthy topic. As I'm sure you'll hear from our speakers, the United States is on an unsustainable and troubling fiscal trajectory. So I can remember 25 years ago, here on this very stage, when I was sitting in the audience, someone was asked, how will financial markets operate if the U.S. no longer has to issue Treasury securities? And that seems like such a wonderful question to ask these days. But so at the time, debt as a share of GDP was 35% and falling. Today, it's 100% and rising. So it appears we have work to do, and we have tough choices to make. But to be clear, these are difficult decisions. Addressing the fiscal gap will require some combination of changes in tax policy, hard-fought savings in government spending, including potentially to major entitlement programs, and strategies to grow the economy faster. And complicating this process is the fact that we simply don't know how long we have until this fiscal imbalance becomes a crisis. It could be months, it could be decades, it could potentially be never. This uncertainty is undoubtedly unsettling, and the stakes could not be higher. So for these reasons, the Brookings Institution is increasingly focused on studying the long-term fiscal impact. The long-term fiscal trajectory. Okay, we've got great speakers here today. We're going to hear from the Secretary General, Mathias Cormann. He is, of course, the OECD Secretary General. He formerly served as a leader in the Australian government, including such roles as Australian Minister of Finance and leader of the government in the Australian Senate. His academic training is in law, and throughout his career, he's been an advocate for free markets, open markets, free trade, and a rules-based international trading system. The second presentation will be by CEA Chair Jared Bernstein. Prior to his current role, Chair Bernstein served as a member with the Council of Economic Advisors in the Biden administration and chief economist to then Vice President Joe Biden in the Obama administration. He is a longtime fixture in the economic think tank community, and on a personal note, I'll say that I've learned a great deal working with Jared over the years in various capacities. So with those introductions, let me close by thanking the OECD for agreeing to let Brookings host the rollout of the 2024 Economic Survey of the United States. It is a privilege to be part of this effort, and I'm sure this will be an engaging conversation. And with that, let me turn it over to the Secretary General.
Well, thank you very much, Ben, and thank you so much to the Brookings Institution for hosting this release of our 2024 Economic Survey of the United States. To the chair of the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors, Gerald Bernstein, colleagues, friends all. Just seeing whether that is going to arrive on there. Bear with us. There it is. Well, as you can see, the United States is continuing its impressive growth story. Economic growth has expanded at a solid pace since the middle of 2022, after the COVID-19 pandemic temporarily interrupted a steady growth path. GDP in the United States has grown on average by 2.2% per year since 2017, which is much higher than the average of 1.3% across the other 37 OECD countries. Headline inflation has declined significantly since peaking in 2022, but at 2.7% in April has remained above the Federal Reserve's 2% target. Core inflation is also gradually coming down to 2.8% in April, but still elevated services inflation coupled with solid economic growth means that monetary policy easing should wait until there are clearer signs that inflation is durably moderating to meet the target. We project real GDP growth we project real GDP to grow steadily by 2.6% this year, after 2.5% last year, before a modest slowing to 1.8% in 2025. Growth is expected to remain supported by consumer spending and continued strength in the labour market. The unemployment rate is expected to remain at low levels, with 3.9% this year and 4% next year. The gradual decline in inflation is projected to continue further, with headline inflation of 2.4% in 2024 and 2% in 2025. We highlight three policy priorities to reinforce growth and durably increase living standards across the United States. The first is tackling high public debt to help manage growing fiscal pressures and increase resilience to future economic shocks. Public debt as a share of GDP is the third highest among OECD countries. Following the COVID-19 pandemic, gross public debt reached 122% of GDP in 2023, up from 64% back in 2007, before the global financial crisis. There is opportunity now to put public finances on a more prudent path to make the economy less vulnerable to future economic shocks and to ensure that the key public services provided by government are maintained. Under current policies, spending is expected to continue to exceed revenue, leading to a rapid increase in the debt ratio over the coming decades, up to 180% by 2040. Rising costs related to population aging and debt servicing will continue to add upward pressure on public finances. In 2023, the general government deficit rose to 8% of GDP. A steady consolidation of public finances should begin in the fiscal year 2025, as growth has proven resilient. This consolidation should be sustained over the medium term, drawing on a broad package of targeted spending restraint and tax measures. Stabilising the debt ratio will require a reduction in the primary balance of around 3.5% of GDP over the next 5 years. How this adjustment is achieved is ultimately a political and social choice for the United States. Spending efficiency in the United States is low compared with most OECD countries, at 40.1% of GDP relative to 43.7% on average across OECD countries. Most federal spending goes to social programs and interest payments, constraining the scope for spending adjustments. Improving spending efficiency would be key in several areas, notably in the health sector. Because if you look at spending in health, an improvement in health spending efficiency would allow for an actual reduction in health spending. Because US health spending is the highest in the OECD at more than $12,000 per capita. Priorities should be to move more federal health plans to value-based care, reduce drug costs through more price negotiation, and lower the favourable tax treatment of employer-provided health plans. Public revenues also need to be strengthened. The tax base should be broadened, some tax rates increased, and new revenue sources developed. This could include improving tax enforcement, taxing capital more effectively, and moving towards a federal value-added tax. Following successive tax cuts, general government tax revenues stood at 32% of GDP in 2023, the third lowest across the OECD. Selected tax increases and a broadening of the tax base should be envisaged to boost revenues, notably for capital-related incomes and gains. The tax treatment of capital incomes and capital gains in the United States has increasingly reduced the tax burden for higher income and wealthy households. The corporate income tax rises 1.8% of GDP, the fifth lowest in the OECD. A moderate increase in the rate and a broadening of the base can help increase revenues as part of a wider reform package. In addition to targeted spending and revenue measures, a clearer and less complicated budgeting process would help to put the public finances on a more prudent path. The debt ceiling, a statutory limit set by Congress, lacks effective budget constraints and leads to brinkmanship. It should be replaced with a simpler medium-term debt ratio target to improve communication, transparency and accountability, and to increase the medium-term focus of fiscal policy. The second priority for policymakers is to achieve stronger economic growth. Productivity growth and labour supply need to be reinforced to support medium-term economic growth and jobs. There has been a structural slowing in real GDP growth over recent decades due to weakening productivity growth and the economic impact of population ageing. Economic growth averaged 3.4% in the period from 1991 to 2000, slowing to 2.6% in the period up to the global financial crisis from 2001 to 2006, and then 1.8% since 2007. Future productivity growth will benefit from the major investments underway as part of the 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. These projects will help upgrade the rapidly aging stock of public infrastructure and provide a foundation for future growth. Strengthening competition would help improve the business environment and also help to boost productivity. Indicators of competition in the business sector have weakened in recent decades. In the telecommunications sector, for example, prices paid by US consumers are well above those in more competitive markets, highlighting the potential benefits of stronger competition for consumers. Strengthening open trade and investment policies would improve living standards for Americans. Trade policies have become more restrictive in recent years, partly due to concerns about national security. This largely reflects an increase in the number of trade policy interventions related to China. However, provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act and other legislation have also sought to favour the development of domestic production in some sectors, including in transport. The impact and effectiveness of these policies over time should be carefully assessed. More effective childcare subsidies would increase labour supply by enabling women to participate more fully in the labour market. The labour market participation rate of women between 25 and 54 years of age remains 11 percentage points below that of men, despite women having higher average levels of educational attainment. Ensuring that all families eligible for childcare subsidies receive them and introducing a national paid parental leave entitlement would be beneficial first steps in supporting mothers to stay or to return to work. Improving workers' skills through better education is another key step to durably increase productivity. Workers' skills need to continue improving to meet rising demands. Over 3 million additional workers with a bachelor degree or higher are projected to be needed by 2032. This will require both upskilling adults and preparing the next generation of workers by improving the school system. In PISA, the OECD's standardized program for international student assessment, school test scores in mathematics have trended down. Performance gaps between socioeconomic groups are relatively large in the United States. Expanding measures to support the learning of economically disadvantaged school students should be a key priority. The third policy priority is to achieve the green transition. The United States has the fourth highest per capita carbon emissions in the OECD and accounts for 13% of global emissions. Implementing existing carbon mitigation policies should be a priority. There has been a major acceleration in efforts to achieve the climate transition, notably through the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act, the Global Methane Pledge, and tightening of regulations, as well as various measures at the state level. However, additional policy measures are likely to be needed to enable the United States to achieve its objective, its stated objective of net zero emissions by 2050. Carbon pricing policies are currently limited. The gradual introduction of a national broad-based carbon fee should be considered to support existing measures. And this should be part of a package including increased research and development funding to decarbonize the industrial sector and to further increase and further incentives for installing energy-saving technologies in buildings. Decarbonizing the economy will reduce the demand for carbon-intensive jobs, and workers will need to reallocate from high carbon to other sectors, which is why we suggest that additional targeted active labour market policies would support workers in transitioning out of carbon-intensive sectors. In closing, the United States has been a strong source for growth across the OECD and for the global economy, putting the global finances on a more prudent path, boosting productivity growth, and implementing necessary measures to achieve the climate transition will further increase the resilience of the US economy and the living standards of people across the United States. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present our key findings and recommendations, and I look forward to the remainder of the discussion.
All right. So you just had my slides up there. You want to make sure they're up? Well, thanks so much, Mathias, for that, walking us through this really important timely report. Ben, it's a great pleasure to be here with you. There are two Vice President Harrises in my life, and I love them both. So great to be here with you. I am going to start with a set of points that recognize and try to maybe explain a little bit about this first graph that Mathias started out with. This is a heck of a picture. For those of us who have presided in government over this period, where we've seen uniquely strong growth relative to other advanced economies. Our recovery has been remarkable, both in terms of the growth and maintaining full employment, achieving significant disinflation. Our work isn't done there yet, so please don't confuse any of this with any sort of a victory lap, but achieving the disinflation we've done without much demand loss amidst a fiscal impulse that's been flat and or falling, and very sharp rate hikes to deal with the inflation. What explains these outcomes? That graph requires at least us trying to explain with respect and deference to the president of the Brookings Institution. I think one explanation might be the chairs of the CEA, which would be C.C. Rouse, who's now the president here, and some other guy who I won't mention. But in fact, I'll speak to that in some detail. And then I'm going to talk about the important and common sense suggestions that the report makes. I want to really lean into them and provide feedback both to the audience and to my friends at the OECD, where I am a very active participant, to be clear, as the chair of the Economic Policy Committee. Now, look, I think the first thing we need to do is make a T-shirt with that graph on it, and I strongly recommend that we produce this in the U.S., of course, and that any proceeds go to deficit reduction and the OECD budget. Okay. Back live here. Why is the U.S. A growth outlier? Certainly, the magnitude of our fiscal and monetary support stands out as an important factor here. I have three scatter plots that you may not have seen before, and they form a kind of triumvirate. So I'll show them to you, and I want you to try to keep in mind the last one as we look at the next one. What we see here is on the x-axis, the fiscal support is a share of GDP, and on the y-axis, cumulative real GDP growth. So one very simple conclusion, or at least explanation for our stronger growth record is we had more fiscal and monetary support. Another is one that I've spent a lot of time thinking about in my economics career and devoted the first chapter in our most recent economic report present to, which is what good things that happen when you sustain full employment. So we've been sustaining something like a full employment economy, labor market in the U.S. for, I thought we had some water up here, but I don't see it. No? Oh, it's over there. Okay, I'll get that later. We've had a full employment economy for much of the past couple of years, and when you have an economy like ours, where consumer spending is 70% of GDP, it's more like 55% in Europe and more like 40% in China. Simply sustaining full employment tends to be a pretty important driver of steady and pretty stable growth. Sorry, there's I want to point out this slide. It's from a new publication by a Goldman Sachs research group, and they kind of look at it from the other side of the equation. So they ask with the graph on the right, what would be the effect on consumer spending of a 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate by quintile? And what you see is that consumer spending would be dinged most forcefully at the lower end and less so at the top. Flip that around and think about the impact of that, of the sustained low unemployment rate where we've seen strong wage growth, particularly at the middle and the bottom, and its impact on consumer spending has been strong and steady. The graph on the right speaks more to asset prices. But there are other factors that might be in play here as well. So consumer spending, this is when we talk about the middle out, bottom up growth. That's what that Goldman Sachs slide is talking about, how in a 70% consumer spending economy with larger multipliers at the lower end, if you have that kind of job market generating this kind of wage results, not only do you see some wage compression, which is very welcome, but it supports aggregate consumer spending. Of course, excess savings has been an important part of the mix here, and folks at the fiscal group here have done nice work on that, documenting the importance of excess savings. I think those have largely burnt off for the bottom half, but they've been important. In our chapter on the benefits of full employment, we think about whether there's a productivity multiplier at full employment. This is all quite theoretical. I think it would be a mistake to assert it too firmly, but it kind of makes sense. If firms are trying to maintain unit profits when labor costs are going up, they have an incentive to boost productivity in order to maintain their margins. Now, classical economists would say, well, any firm that isn't optimizing its productivity, maximizing its productivity, should be out of the economy. But that's not really how it works. And so, various people have speculated that perhaps there's a full employment productivity multiplier in the spirit that I said. You just have more incentive to find efficiencies in a high-pressure labor market. I think that's probably true, but I've never seen super compelling evidence for it. However, there's been some work recently on the increase in job reallocation rates, and this is the idea of people upgrading in a really tight labor market, going across the street to get a better job. In some ways, that may have improved some of the fit and the productivity, certainly lowering search costs. And there's been some nice work on what the survey calls high-propensity business applications. That is, we've seen some really strong business applications, historically strong. And Decker and Haltwanger did a study. These are very rigorous researchers who don't say things about productivity unless they think they have something to say. And they point point out that factors that were kind of working the other way may have contributed to the decline in dynamism and entrepreneurship. So the pandemic-era pattern of business formation may have implications for how productivity evolves going forward. And this is saying that perhaps full employment, increased job reallocation does have a positive productivity effect. I offer those as somewhat speculative, but I think important potential benefits of full employment and costs of not being at full employment. But of course, we can't talk about our growth record without talking about inflation, which has also been obviously a very important factor in what we've seen. And here I have a couple of other slides that you may or may not have seen, and I think they're important. Remember the first slide. Let's do the triumvirate here. So the three slides show, first, we had stronger fiscal policy and stronger growth. Okay, that's kind of commonsensical, I hope. Secondly, well, okay, but did you have more inflation? Same variable on the x-axis, stronger, it's the same fiscal support variable on the x-axis, but this time the y-axis is cumulative core inflation. And here you see more of a random scatter plot. We're up there on the fiscal support, as I already showed you, but we're kind of in with the rest of the pack on cumulative inflation. So let's put that all sort of together in this graph 3, which kind of is trying to encapsulate pretty much all the points I've made thus far, which is, in this case, now we have real GDP growth on the x-axis and cumulative inflation on the y-axis. And here you see the U.S. is an outlier. We've talked about that's what the T-shirt graph shows. And yet we're in the middle of the pack when it comes to cumulative inflation. Inflation was very much a global phenomenon where we are an outlier vis-a-vis other advanced economies. It's not on inflation, it's on growth. I think those points have been underappreciated in the inflation debate. So I hope that I hope that we can amplify those points. I'm getting the interest of time. I'm going to skip this. Okay, I'll get to this in a. So now I want to speak about the report itself. And what I want to do here is actually go to the report suggestion box, the survey suggestion box. Everything you see here is pulled right out of the report. Each one of these are friendly suggestions for things we ought to do to achieve some of the goals that both Ben and Mathias talked about. The federal budgeting process is complex and fails to impose effective budget constraints. The debt ceiling lacks credibility and has led to brinkmanship. I'm going to list each one of those and give you CEA's view on them and the administration's view on them. So we agree, and we've tried to work in a bipartisan manner to address precisely these constraints. The Fiscal Responsibility Act, passed about a year ago, is an example of this work involving compromise and yielding $1 trillion in deficit reduction. The FRA also temporarily suspended the debt limit through January 1st. That said, no question, the budget process is a mess, and that doesn't help. And weaponizing the debt ceiling is beyond irresponsible. But I think this is only part of what's holding us back here. It's also the case that there are few incentives to pursue a fiscally responsible path, and at least thus far, not much by way of penalties for not doing so. With liquid debt markets and generally smooth auctions, other than warnings from the usual suspects, deficit finance can too often seem like a free lunch. Any interest rate effects from individual measures are small, and it's hard to pull any signal from the noise. I well remember testifying at a hearing set up by the Republican majority about the evils of rising debt. The hearing was suspended temporarily. We were sitting in there waiting for them as they went to the floor so members could go to the floor to vote for a deficit finance tax cut. Taxes have been on a one-way downward ratchet for too long, a problem we try to reverse in our budget. But not only do most Republicans refuse to break the ratchet, they've insisted on reducing funding to the IRS, which we view as a shadow tax cut for wealthy tax evaders. Just last week, the rescission of a chunk of that funding was scored by the CBO as raising the deficit by over $30 billion over 10 years. Look, nobody's perfect in this space, but in our budget, we try very hard to stop digging deeper through both highly progressive tax increases that both raise revenues and inject some much-needed fairness into the tax code, along with over $400 billion in spending cuts, according to the CRFP. So that's, part one. Health expenditures per capita are the highest in the OECD. True. But in this area, we've made some real progress. In this area, we've made some real progress, both through the Affordable Care Act and most recently through the Inflation Reduction Act legislation that finally allows Medicare to bargain for lower prices. Joe Biden managed to get that one across the legislative goal line. The importance of savings within the Medicare system cannot be overstressed. What you see here are CBO's projections of Medicare expenditures in different vintages, with 2009 at the top. That's where we thought Medicare was going back then. And then post-ACA, you see that line coming down in highly meaningful ways with spending as a share of the economy. The importance of these savings, critically important. ACA payment, the Affordable Care Act payment reforms for Medicare providers and private Medicare Advantage issuers have been one important source of savings, as has been slower growth in prescription drug expenditures, decline in hospitalizations relative to what was expected given our aging population. Now, our budget extends the health insurance trust fund solvency indefinitely by modestly increasing the Medicare tax rate on incomes above $400,000, closing loopholes in existing Medicare taxes, and directing revenue from the net investment income tax into the health insurance trust fund, which was, by the way, its original intention. While the savings relative to earlier baselines, showing here, have accrued, we also take great pride in the fact that uninsured rates, the share of persons with no health insurance over the full year, are at historic lows, as shown in this figure. So bend the cost curve in healthcare while getting to historic lows in uninsured rates. We consider that a very important and, again, I think somewhat underappreciated accomplishment. The uninsured rate reached a record low last year of below 8%. Back to cost cutting, we'd like to build on this progress. We'd like to build on this progress we've made by giving Medicare additional authority to negotiate down prices for more drugs and start negotiating prices sooner after drugs launch. These actions are twofers. They help both the fiscal budget and the family budget. In various analyses, the OECD points out some of the structural reasons for this stark international discrepancy that you saw on their scatter plot, where we were a huge outlier on health spending and right in the middle of the pack on life expectancy, and other forms of market power and market failures, all of which provide rent-seeking opportunities and push up U.S. prices. So we have a lot more work to do in that space. Next, tax changes over past decades have narrowed the tax base and made the tax system less progressive. So I take the point about the base, but our revenue proposals are highly progressive, and raise over $4 trillion over 10 years. Again, first thing you do, stop digging. After proposed investments in the Biden-Harris agenda, that is, we pay for our spending priorities, that leaves us with $3 trillion in deficit reduction over 10 years. Moving a little more quickly so I can wind up and get to our conversations, a broadly based carbon fee would help achieve the 2030 emission target in an efficient way. You will be hard-pressed to find an economist who disagrees with that assertion. Every time I go to Europe, I hear it a lot. One of the things you don't see a lot of in a survey chapter like this, understandably, is, an understanding of some of the political constraints we face. When Jay Inslee, as governor of Washington State, tried 3 times in Washington State, probably one of the most climate-conscious governors we've seen, tried 3 times to pass the carbon tax and failed. So you have to think of what's second best. And I think we've done more than any past administration when it comes to climate mitigation policy. Happy to talk about that during our conversation if we want. The economy The U.S. economy and many workers derive significant benefits from integration into global value chains. So here I think the OECD is suggesting that we want to make sure we continue to tap the benefits of open economies. I take this as a concern that our industrial policy and some tariff actions have threatened isolationism or going beyond what Jake Sullivan spoke about, maybe from this stage, as a high fence, small yard. Now, I've given numerous speeches that you can find where I've stressed that our push for fairer and more worker-centered trade should not be taken as a rejection of the survey's correct principles. We still very much support robust trade flows, though we do not hesitate to protect American producers, and given the sharp rise of public-private investments in key sectors here in domestic ventures, American taxpayers against unfair dumping of underpriced goods to capture future market share is a motivation that we want to respect. At CEA, we've called this our both-and trade policy. Americans are consumers who, of course, benefit from the supply effects of trade. And in fact, trade flows remain as robust as ever, even as there's been some reallocation away from China. But Americans are also workers, and some live in communities that have been hollowed out by the loss of anchoring businesses and factories. We've been explicit about avoiding China shock, too. As I put it in a recent talk, we're happy to import disinflation. We will not import deindustrialization. As I read this very thoughtful and thorough chapter, and as I crafted the responses to the suggestion box I just took you through, I had a nagging feeling that something was missing. Not from the chapter itself, but what I read, understandably, given the survey's remit, left out a lot of what we do at CEA with the White House economic team. I just read the chapter and think about all the great points it makes, and then I was thinking, well, this isn't like, there's a lot we do in our day job here that isn't quite here. And I wanted to leave you with some thoughts about that, and there are quite a few thoughts, so be patient. If you think of Bidenomics as a policy designed to reconnect the economic lives of low and middle income families to the growth in the overall economy, the principle that if you're helping to bake the pie, you ought to get a fair slice, then all of these granular policies for which we fought for and continue to fight are the glue or the connective tissue that comprises this reconnection agenda. So here's what I'm thinking about. Getting rid of non-compete clauses in worker contracts where they don't belong, updating the overtime threshold so people who should get time and a half do so, making sure regular workers who are not misclassified as independent contractors, taking them out from the umbrella of labor protections, helping to stabilize the child care sector during the worst of the pandemic, standing up a National Labor Relations Board that works for workers, recognize the importance of union bargaining clout in that fair share calculation I just mentioned, protecting the pension of over 1 million workers and retirees through the Bush-Lewis Act and the ARP, preventing cuts of 37% on average, a $15 minimum wage for workers on federal contracts, relief of student debt burdens for millions of Americans, the launch of the most progressive income-based support program on record for college borrowing, significantly increasing uses of apprenticeship programs, improving the administration of the unemployment insurance program, lowering health insurance premiums by an average about $800 per year for millions of Americans by expanding the ACA premium tax credits, capping prescription drug costs at $2,000 per year, allowing Medicare to negotiate lower prescription drug prices, requiring companies to pay rebates if their prescription prices outpace inflation, capping insulin costs at $35 per month for Medicare beneficiaries, rental assistance and eviction moratoriums, providing a low-income family of four with about $2,000 more for groceries each year by improving SNAP, listing 3 million people out of poverty, launching the summer electronic benefit program for nearly 21 million children, finalizing a rule that bans junk insurance projects, going after junk credit cards and credit card fees and overdraft fees, restoring respect for central bank independence, standing up the Competition Council and the Supply Chain Resilience Council to maintain and build on the progress we've made. Okay. I know they say Democrats are a bit listy, But I don't tick those off to show how busy we've been. As folks here like Ben know, every one of those initiatives requires a multi-component policy process. I did so to highlight something that you wouldn't expect to get from a survey chapter. That's not what it's for. So again, no shade here. I've read all the survey chapters, and I thought this version particularly stands out for its scope and for its facts. But what you won't get from a survey chapter like this is who's fighting for whom. Yet that point is extremely important to us, especially now. However the forthcoming politics play out, just like we have a limited time here on Earth, any team has a limited time in the White House. What you choose to do with that time, who you choose to fight for, matters a great deal. I hope I've conveyed our priorities to you in these few minutes, both in terms of full employment macro, low and middle income micro, and tax fairness. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jared. Thank you, Mathias. So the Secretary General has a flight in 20 minutes. We'll have to end this. The flight is not in 20 minutes. His departure time is in 20 minutes. So I'm going to ask a few questions, then we'll give the audience an opportunity to ask a few questions. Jared, I wonder if you made news with something, so I've got to ask you about it. Uh-oh. So carbon fee. So you noted that every economist would back a carbon fee as a strategy for reducing carbon emissions. The Biden administration has a fee on methane emissions. The Biden administration recently came out with a new social cost of carbon. But the Biden administration has not yet backed a carbon fee. Is that right?
Yeah, so I should probably refrain a little bit. So look, I'm sure there are economists who would be against a price on carbon. I guess the point I was making was that when there's a negative externality, the way to internalize that externality is often through the price, and that's why I think for most economists, that makes sense. And we've seen, Nobel laureates like Bill Brainerd, win Nobels for this line of thinking. My point was that our action has been more through a system, obviously, of subsidies, and that's we think we've made some real progress there.
I see. Okay, great. So turning back to the topic of the main topic of the survey, which was around long-term fiscal imbalance, let me ask you something we've been sort of thinking about here at Brookings, at least within economic studies. So the Secretary General showed you figure 2.1, which ranked all of the OECD countries' debt as a share of GDP. United States was fourth from the worst, but right above the U.S. was Italy, and then past that was Greece. Greece's economy is 1/100th the size of the United States. Is debt to GDP, or is relative debt to GDP, the right way to think about fiscal challenges and fiscal burdens, or is there something special about the United States, given its role in financial markets, given the size of the economy? How should we think about fiscal burdens, and what's the right target?
Yes,
and go ahead. Yeah, Jared, and then the Secretary.
Okay, so I think both the level matters, but yes, we have a special place in the global economy, certainly in global financial markets. We of course have the dominant reserve currency, and so I think most economists who are concerned about this trajectory, and the chapter does an absolutely fantastic job of exploring every corner of that concern, are worried less about the level and more about stabilization. And so stabilizing debt to GDP is a really important goal that I think many of us would like to achieve with not without regard for the level. It's not immaterial, but stabilization. I think many of us would put it as the first goal.
Do you have thoughts?
The United States recently reached a situation where you spend more on debt interest repayments than on defense. And as you have increasing debt levels at the same time as you have increasing interest rates, that is one structural pressure that, with growing debt, that starts to limit some of your flexibility in relation to other structural pressures. I mean, we are at a time when there's going to be a significant fiscal impact from population aging. There is a fiscal pressure in terms of national security-related requirements. There is the likelihood of a future external shock. And you know, of course, I mean, as you continue to increase your overall debt level, it does have an impact on your recurrent fiscal capacities too. And what we're saying is, I mean, the United States has successfully pursued fiscal consolidation in the past. There is actually scope for the United States to get itself in a stronger fiscal position on the back of a comparatively strong economic growth performance. And both on the spending side and on the revenue side of the budget, there are sensible things the United States could do. And we think that over the medium to long run, it will put the US in a stronger economic and a stronger fiscal position. Now, you know, in the end, I mean, these are choices and these are trade-offs. But I mean, debt incurred today is not cost-free. I mean, somebody has to pay it back at some point. I mean, you know, it's essentially, I mean, any level of debt incurred today is deferred taxation or deferred spending cuts. And, you know, and really, I mean, what we're saying is in a sensible fashion, by getting onto the right trajectory over the medium to long term, you can get yourself back into a position where you can deal with your structural spending pressures that we know are coming more sensibly, and you can also put yourself in a position where you are in the best possible situation to deal with any future external shock. I mean, there are reasons why the debt position is where it is. As you know, there was obviously the big fiscal shock related to the pandemic. There was a big fiscal shock related to the global financial crisis. But you know, it's a matter of getting yourself in a stronger position over time.
Let me just say one thing about that. I think that we should speak more when we think about this, about what we're incurring debt for. I think it makes a big difference whether you're incurring debt to provide a tax cut for wealthy individuals and high-end corporations versus investing in the mitigation of climate change. So I want to be careful not to abstract from what we're spending or investing in as if that is immaterial to this discussion. It's definitely not.
Mathias, can I ask you a question, which is one of the strategies that the OECD identified was better tax administration. So the Biden administration has weighed in on this. There was an $80 billion pay for in the Inflation Reduction Act. But in the U.S., tax administration is extremely politicized. And so do you have any lessons for the U.S. in terms of not just, yes, tax administration, you know, more spending, but how to depoliticize that strategy?
Well, I'm the Secretary General of a nonpartisan, entirely non-political organization. So I'm not going to weigh into the domestic political debates in the United States. I mean, our policy recommendations, you know, are there for all to see. And I mean, we think that there are sensible things that can be done, but please don't ask me to weigh into the domestic political debate of the United States.
So you're going to give us something to go for.
Jared, are you surprised by how political tax administration has become?
No. In a word, no, not at all. I mean, I think the key thing here is what I said in my talk, which is that defunding the IRS has become a shadow tax cut for the wealthiest tax evaders. And I think it's really important to distinguish between tax evasion, that's illegal, and nobody who respects the rule of law should support illegal tax evasion. Tax avoidance is a different thing, and that's how why companies have gazillions of tax lawyers so they can figure out how to avoid tax using tricks in the code, and that's legal. And, we may dislike it, but it's not in violation of the law. But nobody should support tax evasion. And here at Brookings, guys and gals here have done great work on the magnitude of the tax gap that is in the hundreds of billions of dollars per year due to these evasions.
So the last question, Jared, this is just for you really quickly. So the OECD recommended replacing the debt ceiling with a medium-term debt target. you think that will ever happen, and do you think it's a good idea?
Well, I don't understand. If it's in the chapter, I didn't read that part carefully enough to give you the best feedback on that. I don't understand how the target, really solves the problem. And maybe Mathias could talk to us about that. If the target gets you back to where we are right now, then of course I wouldn't want to go there. But maybe you can help us.
Well, looking from the outside in, and again being entirely non-partisan, having a hard ceiling that leads to like a government shutdown doesn't seem to be the most constructive way to manage fiscal policy over the medium to long term. I mean, there are governments around the world, there are governments around the OECD that do have medium-term debt ratio targets. And it's part of the public conversation as to whether you're tracking against target or not, and what the reasons for that are, and that's part of the democratic discourse, and it leads to hopefully over time adjustments to policy measures. But to have a hard debt ceiling,
so it's a soft target.
So well, it's a target that helps to inform the public conversation. I mean, in the United States, it seems to us that you have a very complex and quite convoluted budget process. And then you've got a very hard hitting ceiling that leads to a very disruptive shutdown in government. I mean, there must be a better way, is what we're saying.
Yeah, agree.
Great. So let's turn to questions from the audience. I am begging you to make your questions. We only have a few minutes, so please identify yourself, ask your question quickly, and we can hear from our esteemed experts. Yes, in the back there, please.
Hi, my name is Julian Berman, econ student at Harvard, working at Lawfare. My question is, how do you think the United States GDP growth trajectory will be affected by the widespread implementation of generative AI? What do we predict the impact will be on total factor productivity? Can we assume a rise in capital stock proportionate to the rise in TFP? And do we anticipate effects on wages, and whether any of these implications are priced in to your forecast for GDP in the next couple of years?
Just a very easy question. Let me just make the general point that, I mean, the upside opportunity from AI and generative AI and rapidly developing technological innovation, the upside opportunities and the benefits that it can help develop, including on productivity, but quality of service across a broad range of sectors, are very, very significant. And overwhelmingly, the potential is very positive. But of course, as with anything and any rapidly developing new technology, there's also a whole series of downside risks and disruptions that come with it. And the public policy response to that is going to be important to help optimize the benefits and maintain the pathway of continued innovation, but while also making sure that that some of those downside risks and disruptions, from privacy to competition, from access and to security, that all of that is well mitigated, well managed, and in a sensible fashion. Now, I think it's still early days. I mean, we do think that there's some serious risks when it comes to AI, for example, on the competition front. And I mean, these are things that we're going to have to respond to with sensible policy, and that will depend. That will drive how positive the impact of it is going to be. Is it factored into our growth forecast directly and forensically at this point? No, because it's it's just one of the overall factors in terms of the overall development of the economy. But I'd be interested in...
very quickly, so we get to other questions, I'm going to take a shortcut. So we wrote a chapter in the most recent economic report of the president where we tried to plumb the questions like those you raised. So just go read the chapter. Where Mathias landed, though, about trying to manage and put proper guardrails here, that's something this White House has taken very seriously, and we have an executive order which we are currently implementing on precisely those matters.
So let's go over here for a question.
No, thank you. Christian Forstner, Hans Seidel Foundation. You talked about the strong U.S. economy, yeah, and Bidenomics. But why do people don't believe it? Yeah, well, I mean, the president going into an election. Why is Bidenomics not a major campaign asset, yeah, for the president?
I think that's for you, Jared.
Well, first of all, we have someone here who's written about that, which is Ben. And so if you want to give a few sentences about your work.
Well, I mean, there's lots of different hypotheses. One is misinformation, so fundamental negative bias in the media. Another is a change in the source of information, so people turning to social media, perhaps over more traditional types of news sources. A third is that, you know, while the economy overall is doing very well, we've had a wealth explosion, the labor market's incredibly strong, we're having relatively strong growth, I could go on, and it may be that the atypical experience with inflation is dominating those other factors. And then the fourth hypothesis around what Wall Street journalist Greg Ip calls referred pain, that maybe people are just unhappy about other things going on in society, potentially geopolitical stress and conflict, potentially the impact of ongoing economic inequality, although that's been mitigated as of the past couple of years. But so they're really not upset about the state of the macroeconomy. They're upset about other things. There are a lot of different hypotheses, and at Brookings, we've been doing a lot of work around it.
The only thing I'd add to that is I put a lot of weight on the price level. Not just inflation, but the price level. So if people remember that eggs used to cost $1.80, and eggs cost $2.50. The fact that they were $5 and now they're $2.50 doesn't necessarily assuage them when they still remember what things used to cost. So you might say, well, if that's the case, are you permanently screwed, or does this kind of gap just last forever? And of course it doesn't. Or people like me would be walking around unhappy that gas doesn't cost 60 cents a gallon, because when I started driving, that is what it cost. And so two things has to happen for people to feel better and get past this transition. I actually think all the things Ben said makes this, what I'm about to say, harder. But the two things that have to happen is enough time has to pass so you can reset your price level expectations while your real pay catches up. And in fact, if you look at a recent post we put on the CEA blog, how many people here read the CEA blog? Wow, that's a sad commentary. So look at we just posted something on grocery prices, wherein we show how much the average worker has to work to buy a bag of groceries. It's actually a little lower now than it was pre-pandemic. Now, the average person doesn't do that calculation, so don't get me wrong. But that's the kind of dynamics that have to happen. And I think what Ben just took you through kind of jams the signal in a way that maybe makes that take longer.
We have time for one last quick question. Let's go here in the white, please.
Yes, my name is Anne Brooks. I'm originally from Germany. Sorry. I'm with EEA Economic Advisory, and I was wondering, whoever wants to take that question, have you done projections as to the economic outcome with a Trump presidency and, in contrast, a Biden presidency? And if you have, could you summarize them and compare them? Thank you.
That sounds pretty political.
Sounds to me like a partisan question.
I'm going to punch on your behalf. Jared, you have 1 minute.
Well, no, I have restrictions on what I can talk about in politics as well. So here, I will just give you some references. So the economist Mark Zandi just published a report that does exactly that. So go look at his report. I would say there's another, I thought, very useful report by Kim Klausing and Mary Lovely from the Peterson Institute, which also looks at some of the questions you've raised, and I'm just going to have to leave it there.
So with that, the Secretary General has a plane to catch. Please join me in thanking our two esteemed panelists. If everyone just for 30 seconds so the OECD team can go catch a flight, I'd be very grateful.